Welcome back to Hogback Observatory in Gallup, New Mexico. This is a series of videos to demonstrate how to assemble a PureTech Telestation Observatory. The next step in the installation of the Telestation Observatory is to install the motor and gearbox units. You'll see on each end wall, the one with the door, and right there you can see the rails going up. And on the back wall, you can see them there as well. And it is here where we will install the motor units. As you can see on the rails here, there's going to be a slot that goes through each rail. And on that is where we're going to put the gearbox, which will slide into those two rails and down onto these blocks right here, which have your jack screws to adjust them up and down later on when we want it to mesh with the gear that moves the roof. I'm going to go down and show you the gearbox unit and how you need to prep it in order to drop it into the slots on those rails. The motor for the Telestation consists of two parts. One is the motor itself, and the other one is the gearbox assembly. And that's what you see here in this video. Word of warning, both are very heavy. And if you can get a helper for an extra set of hands to help you with this step, it would be nice. With the proper preparation, you can do it by yourself with a bit of grunt work, but extra set of hands is always a nice thing. So here you can see is the mounting plate with the gearbox on the back. And on this side of the mounting plate, you'll see a block here and a block inside there. Those two blocks, once this slides down onto the rails, are what are going to sit on top of the jack screws right here. So these drop-in nuts right here will be slid inside the rails to hold it, and then it will rest upon these jack screws. So we have to prep this so that it's ready to do that step right there. And how we're going to do that is we're going to loosen these screws right here. Let me get my picture right here. We're not going to take them out. We're just going to loosen them enough so that the nuts on this side are probably at the end of the bolt. That should give you the clearance on all 6 of these to then be able to slide them down into the rails. Now once you loosen them, gravity should help you by causing these nuts here to be facing straight down. If not, then just move them yourself. Make sure they're straight down so you're prepped to slide this into position. Before I show you the prep for the gearbox, I'm going to show you some handy dandy tools that you're going to want to have on hand to do this. First of all, for most of the construction of the Telestation, you'll want a 1/4 inch Allen and a 3/16 Allen. That will loosen and tighten most of your screws that you need on here. Another thing to have is a long blade, straight blade, long and skinny screwdriver. That will come in handy to help you to move some of these drop-in nuts up and down the rails or get them in position, whatever else, but we'll cover that as we go. And the last thing here is a magnet. This one is a telescoping magnet. Now, to let you know, most of the Telestation is made of aluminum. What's that mean? That means aluminum is a non-ferrous metal, which means it cannot be magnetized. A magnet will not stick to it. However, what is not aluminum is a lot of these nuts and bolts. And they're the ones that can be challenging to hold in place while you need to thread the bolt from the other side to screw into the drop-in nut while it's in these channels. So it's good to have one of these on hand to be a little helper in those tight spaces. Okay, so now let's go to the prep. As I mentioned earlier, to loosen these bolts on this side of the plate, the mounting plate, so that your drop-in nuts would be loose and ready to drop in the channel, and you want them to be facing down so that when you get up there with this heavy thing, you can get them lined up with the channels and get them to slide in. This screwdriver is going to be a help getting them lined up. And then once you do that, this will slide down in both rails and easily bring it down to rest on the jack bolts. Now I will not be able to film actually doing that because I don't have enough hands to hold the camera, lift this heavy thing, line it up, and do everything needed to get this to slide down those slots in the rails. So I'm going to bring you up here real quick to the top, where you can see in the top of these rails right here is our one side, and here's the other side where those drop-in nuts are going to line up and slide down until the whole assembly is resting on these jack bolts. If you ever want to see an old fat man on the verge of having a heart attack and cursing to high heaven, then you should have seen what I just tried to do. Handy dandy little tip, also have some painter's tape available, so you can tape those bolts on this side to hold them to that plate. Otherwise you're on top of a ladder holding a heavy weight with these things flopping all over the place, going in and out. I want to do everything but go down into the slot or the groove in the rail. Put a little painter's tape on there, hold that, so at least they won't be popping in and out, and then it's much easier to align these. My wife says I'm a fool, but I'm her fool, so she puts up with me. Let's see how this works. And there it is, the gear assembly in place. With the painter's tape over those bolts on this side made it a whole lot easier, but when those top two went to slide in, everything was leaning back a little bit, so had to really lift up a little bit on this. Make sure you push that towards the rail, this plate, and make sure those bolts were pushed all the way in. And that this thing was straight up and down, not cocked off to the side a little bit. Once you did that, the top two went in there, she slid right down and nice right on to the jack bolts. I'll go ahead and tighten this up and we'll start with the next thing. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is we are going to attach the motor underneath the gearbox. This is done by, there's 4 holes right here that go through the gear housing flange plate. The 4th one is back here. There's 2 other ones, one on either side, that are threaded holes, and those are not used in attaching the motor to the gear housing. So inside the motor box, there should be a package with 4 bolts that have Loctite, like blue Loctite on them. You'll see it's like this blue gooey stuff on one side stripe. Those 4 sit inside these holes and screw when you lift up the motor and line it up underneath. You'll see it has the shaft on the motor has to go in here, and you see the little keyway here with the motor in the box. Taped to the side of the motor will be a little piece of metal, which is the key, which basically goes in this slot. There's a slot here, there's a slot in the shaft of the motor, and the key goes in between those so that it can turn the shaft on the motor. I'll go over that when I bring the motor up and set it up and show you. But we'll have to make sure that when you lift the motor up, that key is in the keyway on the shaft and goes up in the keyway here in the motor housing, and then you push the whole thing up, and with the bolts that are here, you screw those in, those 4 bolts, to pull the motor tight. So here's the motor out of the box, and as I mentioned with it, there's a little package that has the bolts in there. There's 4 of them, and you can see this blue right here is the Loctite that's on there. And as you tighten it, the motor to the gearbox housing, it will spread this Loctite, and then it will set up and help keep these nice and tight. Now here's the motor, and again here's the shaft, and as you can see right here is the keyway. On the side of the motor taped, this is the key. Now this key has some grease on it, which is good. If it didn't, you'd want to put some there, because once you take that and you slide it into that keyway, that grease will help it stay there so it doesn't just keep falling out. Because as we see over here, that has to line up again with the keyhole or the keyway in the gearbox housing. Now I'll give you a little tip right here. Set your motor to where this bracket, which will not be bolted into anything, but it's there affixed to the motor, have that facing away from you, and that will be the part when you put the motor up will face the wall. The reason this is important is, number one, it will match up the holes in the gearbox flange to the threaded holes on the motor housing, so you can screw it in easily and everything will be lined up correctly. Second one, and maybe more importantly, is the shaft on this motor is easy to turn. The gear on this gearbox is not so easy. And why that matters is because if you move that gear, that spins. Let me get this to focus. That will spin this part of the gear housing where you have the keyway. So since it is easier to spin the shaft on the motor, you want to index that shaft or turn it so that and the key that's in the keyway is going to match where it is on this one. So if you're looking straight at this, you'll see straight here is where that it needs to couple, and a little bit to the left is where the keyway is. And here's where the bolt hole is. So it's a little bit clockwise, depending on which way you're looking at it, of that bolt hole. So we're going to go back over here. This is a bolt hole that matches up with the one I just pointed at, and we take the shaft and we spin it back to where it's just a little bit off of that, and that way we're going to put the keyway or the key into this keyway and have this pretty close to lined up. It's not going to be exact, but instead of having to fumble around with it when you're up there and risk knocking the key out of the keyway, you should be pretty close. And as we lift this up, you're going to be maybe crouched down or whatever you need to be so you can look at this shaft. Look at the shaft, see where you see the shaft and the keyway, line them up with the bottom of the gearbox, and it should slide right in. And then once that slides right in, because it's close to the position, if these are off a little bit, you can move the motor just a little to line it up with the bolts and get your bolts started. If you start with this way off to the other side, you're going to have to do a lot of jostling, spin around everything to get everything to line up. So set it up beforehand, index where that keyway in your motor housing is, and set the shaft where it's pretty close in respect to that bolt hole and the keyway in your gear housing there. That way you'll just have to barely make a little adjustment to get it all to slide in and these bolt holes to be lined up. So before you go and lift this over there, take your bolts, place them, one there, one here. Let me get this out of my way here. Remember, these ones on the side that are smaller and threaded you do not use. So you're going to put these 4 in so they're ready to go. And the tool you're going to need right here is you can get an open end wrench. This is a combination wrench, which means one side is open, one side is closed. This happens to be a ratcheting one, so it makes it very easy to tighten them down. But you'll need at least an open end ratchet. This one is 14 millimeter. A 9/16 or a 14 fits those bolts well. 14 fits a little better. So I'll walk this over. It's already close to lined up. I'll get under here where I can see it. I'll line the shaft with the hole here in the keyway. Get that in the keyway, starting to go in, and then turn it a little if I need to, till the bolts are lined up, and then I'll start a bolt by hand on this side and this side, so it kind of holds it. You'll want to hold with one hand up underneath, and then you can start these 4 screws, and then you can use your wrench or open end combination, whatever you use, and tighten all those bolts down. A little here, a little there, a little there. That way it brings it up even. Don't just take one and screw it all the way tight, because you risk tilting that motor maybe and jamming up that shaft a little bit. You want to do each one of these bolts a little bit at a time, so it evenly brings that motor housing right up to the flange plate on the gearbox housing, and you'll get a nice fit that way. Now, I can't do the video at the same time I'm doing this because I only have the 2 hands, but I will come back to it after it's all bolted up and show you. Okay, here we are. Motor's all bolted up. It's not that hard. It's heavy, but it's not as heavy as that gearbox. But the motor's a little heavy, but lined right up with the key in the keyway. Slid right up in there, pushed up. We're able to hand tighten the bolts as mentioned earlier. Everything's good and tight now. Again, a little bit here, a little bit, go across. Do like say this corner and then the opposite corner. And then this corner and the opposite corner. Don't just do one bolt, don't just do one side. Do opposite sides, that way it brings it up more even. Bring them up a little, then a little on the other opposites. And keep working it till you get up there, and good and snug. Don't need to break the bolts off, but make sure it will come all the way up, flush to that plate. Okay, at some points it'll seem like the bolt is getting real tight. If you still got a gap, keep going, it'll keep going, and then you'll get them all up there tight and snugged up. So she's all good, one on that side, and one on the opposite wall. So there's the gearbox, the motor assembly, and we'll keep progressing from here.